Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us at this BugCrowd webinar that we're putting on around the lessons learned and how we think about Equifax as a catalyst for change in the way that we think about cybersecurity. My name is Casey Ellis. I am the founder and CTO of BugCrowd.
And my name is Jonathan Cran. I'm the VP of Product here at BugCrowd. So today what we're going to talk about is sort of some of the facts around Equifax and dig into lessons that we can take from that. We're going to propose a particular solution and then dig into some proof points around that solution near the end of it.
In terms of the proof point, that's a really interesting piece that is definitely worth hanging around for. So it's great to have you here, and let's run through it. Before we get into that, just to speak briefly about us, BugCrowd is a platform that connects security researchers from all around the world with our customers to help identify and prioritize vulnerabilities so they can be fixed before they're exploited. Essentially, we operate bug bounty programs and hacker on demand programs. But that's a good preamble into the next slide, which is that we're not a silver bullet, nor is any other security solution that's out there. I think the thing that's we were really thinking about as we were putting this talk together is just to call out the fact that we're not touting ourselves as the only solution a company needs to prevent something like Equifax, nor is any other security solution or indeed security strategy that's out there. Security is a multi-layered endeavor, and it's something that's iterating and changing constantly. And the reason I call that out and labor the point a little is that if you're listening to this Equifax webinar, you've probably listened to a couple of other ones as well. So maybe keep that in mind when you're listening over in other places as well.
Yeah, it's a process, right? And we should always keep repeating that. Security is a process.
That said, we think we can do a lot to help the prioritization of broader security efforts. So that's part of what we'll be talking about in this webinar.
So on this slide, we talk a little bit about the timeline of events. And so, a couple key points here. This is a framework level issue in Apache Struts. The CVE was 5638. I was in the parser, and ultimately it was a deserialization issue. Equifax was notified of this on March 9th after it was patched by the Apache Struts folks on March 6th. And we know, shortly after they were notified, scanning started to happen. And we were seeing that, across the organization. And on May 13th, we found out later that they were actually breached with this particular bug, and that the breach wasn't discovered until July 29th. So there's quite a span of time from the original notification into the actual discovery of the breach and ultimately into the notification public on September 7th.
With the scanning, John, that's partly because it was quite a juicy bug in terms of what it was able to achieve, but also was easy to test for.
Yeah, simple to test for, honestly. You could basically make a request and inject into the header of the request the actual object that would be deserialized. And so, the key things to take away here are that, when it was actually breached, there was information on 143 million people pulled out, which is approximately 44% of the U.S. population. We know that Equifax had a pretty decent-sized security team, 225 people, according to TechCrunch, and they'd spent over $250 million on cybersecurity in the last 3 years. So it wasn't like they were necessarily understaffed. It was just, what we found out later, a process issue more than anything else, and a breakdown of actually finding the issue. We know that follow-on vulnerabilities were reported after all of this, and that happened around September, mid-September. And ultimately, the takeaway here is that this framework level issue was pretty widely known and was ultimately what led to the breach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from a business impact standpoint as well, 143 million US customers, that's a decent chunk of the working population of the United States. We're not very happy about all of this going down. In terms of the board level and the corporate impact, the CEO, CIO, and CSO were asked to step down, in the process of investigation, discovery, and obviously release of the information to the public after the fact. So there was the technical side and some of the things that happened there, but then also the impact on Equifax as a company as well. So really what we're bringing together in this webinar is how do both the technical learnings that we've been able to derive and really factually understand about the breach, and also the impact that it's had on Equifax as a company and on the general culture of cybersecurity across the market. How does that fundamentally change the way that people that are tasked with defense, how does it change the way they think about cybersecurity as a whole? And we've got a couple of things that we hope will be helpful.
One of the first things that we need to talk about are the basics of an AppSec program. Given that this was an AppSec bug, given that it was in the struts library, given that this is a framework level issue, there are a set of things that are common in vulnerability management programs that are less common and less sophisticated in the AppSec layer. And that's things like vulnerability management, which means discovery of vulnerabilities and prioritization of those vulnerabilities. And that's on top of assuming that you've got buy-in for your security program at the AppSec layer, that you've got a policy in place to fix high severity issues, and that you even know what components you're using, through software composition analysis or other techniques like this. So, there's a set of basics that need to be in place that, it sounds like were in place at Equifax, but there were breakdowns in that process, and that, broke down in the form of scanning for the vulnerability but not actually finding it, and in the communication of that vulnerability, in how it was actually communicated from CERT to the organization.
And then down from the organization receiving the information from CERT back to the engineering teams. One of the inconvenient truths that exists right across the security industry is that 99% of getting ahead of everyone else who's trying to defend themselves is just remembering to do the simple things right, or the basic things. Sometimes those basic things are actually quite difficult to execute, but there's a priority that goes into that we see organizations right across the board continue to struggle with. And, it's unfortunate to say it's a brand new lesson that we should be doing things that we've been talking about for the past 20 years, but the reality of it's true. So the question becomes, how do you go as a security team who maybe knows all of this stuff and has been, trying to evangelize it and get buy-in within the organization for whatever period of time, how do you go from not doing it to getting that buy-in and actually doing it?
So one of the other lessons that we see is that accountability is becoming the new norm. When we see that a web bug or a web framework issue results in 143 million records being stolen, not just any records, social security records, and we see that that results in a CEO, a CIO, a CSO being asked to step down, it's pretty apparent that patching and vulnerability management at an application layer is becoming increasingly important, and that it can result in people's jobs being lost.
Yeah, and I think the thing that is interesting extending on that, there was the House Committee assessment that and conversations that went on with Equifax. So this got high-level visibility from a policy and legislative standpoint. There's a component of accountability coming in there. The part I find really interesting is actually the accountability that's starting to come from the ground up. I had a conversation with some friends of mine about a week after Equifax happened, and they'd had their identity stolen, gave me a call and said, can you come over and help us clean things up? And no matter what I told them, no matter what I could actually share while I was helping them out, I couldn't convince them that Equifax was not the source of that particular issue. And, the reality is it may have been, it actually probably wasn't. But, the fact that a breach that has this level of impact and this type of irrevocable impact on this larger group of people, what it's having the effect of is making the broader internet using population more aware and more concerned, and to the accountability point, more compelled to actually call their vendors to account around how proactive they're being at safeguarding their data, especially when it comes to data like a social security number and PII.
Yeah, I would expect the C-level and the board will ask for more visibility of these processes in their organization, no question, after this.
And what's an interesting thing to speculate about in terms of how the how the market and how, you know, cybersecurity just as a profession progresses over time is, at what point does this start to impact how people actually spend their money? You know, if someone's walking into a store with it in mind that this is a real impact that, you know, their vendors they're about to engage can expose them to, is that going to change how they go out and actually spend money on product? And will they prefer vendors based on that proof, to some extent, the demonstration of the fact that they're more secure than the next guy?
There was certainly a spike in interest after this happened. I mean, we saw it with Google Trends where, you know, there's a massive spike in Equifax, there's a massive spike in data breach interest. I don't know if I'm as bullish on consumers paying attention over a long period of time, but they will start to pay attention if that information starts to be used. I think the key factor is that it has to hurt.
Yeah, exactly. And the interesting part there is that within the cybersecurity industry, we've talked about, you know, pretty much every breach over the last 10 years is the wake-up call that the industry needs, right, to the extent that it's become, you know, a running joke when it's happening a couple of times a week.
Yeah, I mean, this could easily be early 2000 with, you know, the sort of same thing happening, right?
Yeah, but the extent and the level and the depth of the impact on the consumer base, what you end up, you know, having is, you know, 4 people sitting around the dinner table at night, and 3 of them have been compromised over the past, you know, month. So that becomes like a groundswell of conversation. So it'll be interesting to see how that progresses.
Yeah, for sure. So a third lesson that we wanted to bring up is the need to design better feedback loops. And sort of what we mean by better feedback loops is information moving from breakers to builders, and from folks who have information about vulnerability into the hands of folks who need that information in order to fix it. And so with that, you know, one of the lessons that we're taking away is this idea of a better feedback loop.
Exactly. And, you know, designing a better feedback loop was really a big part of the intent of the creation of BugCrowd, and even the work that was done around bug bounties and vulnerability disclosure prior to the bug bounty platform market being created in the first place, with the work of Netscape and Google and Facebook and so on. You know, what it comes down to is the fact that breakers and builders don't think the same. There are more people actually responsible for engineering code and creating it, and actually creating, you know, fundamentally as a byproduct, the opportunities for bad guys to do bad things. You know, this community of people that think a little bit differently in terms of, you know, where are the angles? How can I hack this? How can I get it to do something that it's not meant to do to serve my purpose? Connecting those two together is really critical to make sure that both are getting smarter over time. And that's where the loop comes in, because this is not something you do just once. This is something that happens iteratively and as an improvement that goes on over time.
And better is, you know, sort of a qualifier here. I mean, there are already feedback loops with AppSec programs, right? And those come in the form of DAST, and they come in the form of SAST, and they, you know, with the modern application security program, they can be integrated into the actual release process and the build process. But what we really mean by better here is prioritized information and ultimately information that results in high severity issues that need to be fixed right away.
Yep, and not just the vulnerability. You know, information that results in executive and engineering buy-in around this whole idea of, you know, the priority of actually actioning vulnerability data. It's not just about the bug that gets found. It's about the fact that if it's left alone, you know, as in the case of Equifax, bad things can happen. That's not necessarily just a lesson for the security team when they identify a new issue. It's a lesson and a constant learning that needs to be fed back into the broader team to try to avoid this stuff more effectively in the future.
And ultimately, like the feedback loops that exist in AppSec programs today through DAST and through SAST and other ways of scanning code, they're good and they need to continue to be utilized. We just see a need and sort of a benefit of engaging a larger community of researchers in order to deliver that information.
Exactly. So let's jump into why we think a better security feedback loop is needed. Builders and breakers don't think alike. We've just tapped on that, and I think that's something that's important to recognize. You know, engineers don't code security vulnerabilities in on purpose. They do it because they're focused on building a product that serves a purpose that it's intended to serve. You know, when you have an adversary come in, they're looking for the edge cases around that to exploit it for their purpose, and that's what the breakers come in and actually replicate the feedback that they provide. So there's that. But it goes deeper than that. I think that, one of the challenges that we see right across the industry and all around the world is that security teams are underpowered and they need help. They can be incredibly, filled with incredibly intelligent people, but not only do they have an incredibly, fast-moving and large task to achieve, there's a cybersecurity skills shortage from a hiring standpoint that means that those teams are never going to be as big as they should be to actually be able to do this on their own. That applies in the area of the actual discovery of the vulnerabilities themselves. As we saw with the Equifax stuff, some of the stuff that came out afterwards in the House committee meetings was that pointed to the fact that the particular vulnerability that was exploited was actually missed as a part of the internal security programs. It's not because that's not necessarily a reflection on that security team. There's just a lot to do, and they need help doing it.
And also, shortly after the breach was announced, you saw lots of folks on Twitter actively engaging with each other and discovering issues related to Equifax and both investigating Equifax's attack surface and also stuff that exists on third-party sites such as GitHub and others. And this sort of discovery process, ideally would have been harnessed by Equifax through that process.
Yeah, and engage proactively. I think that's really the big takeaway is that this is a method to get this input in, and the most effective way to engage it is to actually be proactive instead of having to catch the piano, so to speak. Beyond that, the other areas where security teams need help is around actually getting security program budget. Like in Equifax, $250 million is plenty of money to spend. That's not the case for all organizations. And I think prioritization of where that budget is spent and how is also something that security teams need additional help in understanding and forming an opinion on, but then also to actually propagate that opinion throughout the organization for it to be able to get traction. Which brings me to the third point, buy-in from engineering and IT. Security actually isn't the problem of the security team, it's the problem of the business. And the ability for a security team which is underpowered to be able to not only find all of the issues, make sure they've got the right budget, but then also go to the rest of the business and convince everyone that it's important and they need to change certain behaviors based on what they discover, that's a massive task. One of the reasons that we think that security feedback loops from the outside world are a really critical capability to actually impact this is based on really what we've seen as feedback from companies all around the place that run vulnerability disclosure programs, like hearing that a vulnerability was found, but also that it was found from the outside world. That's a far more compelling story for a security team to tell to an engineering department in terms of the reality of the potential of getting breached.
That's huge for prioritization, right? Having something come in from the outside, we hear that all the time. It just vastly increases the priority of an issue if someone outside the organization has found it. For better or worse, right? Sometimes, there are higher priority issues, but if someone from the outside has found it, that's, something that needs to be addressed right away.
Exactly. And the last point here is, the concept that this is lather, rinse, repeat. Like security is not something that you solve once and walk away from. It's continuous and it's iterative. This needs ongoing resourcing. It needs ongoing input. And ideally, this whole feedback loop between builder and breaker both get smarter over time, and you can kind of revolve around each other in expanding circles and make a greater impact on the organization when it comes to risk.
So kind of talking a little bit about how that gets accomplished, we wanted to show an overview of how a vulnerability disclosure program works at BugCrowd. And so here's a diagram just kind of showing the various channels that a submission could come in and get reported into crowd control and go through the validation process to confirm that it's an issue and the prioritization process after that. But I think the key takeaway here is vulnerability disclosure allows a channel for security feedback from the outside world, and this sort of information is so critical to AppSec teams because it allows external feedback to come in. And generally today, most organizations don't have a clear channel for that sort of feedback to come in. And we've seen success with external folks reporting issues like this. When you have a scannable issue like Apache struts, struts, and this particular vulnerability in Apache struts, that's a perfect issue for a disclosure program because it can be so easily discovered from an external party and reported into a channel like this. If you don't have a program like this, you're going to miss that feedback. You're going to miss the ability to sort of know and therefore discover and prioritize that issue. And those are such key steps in this process.
So here's an interesting proof point. Talking about our understanding. On one level, it's unsurprising that we're giving this advice around this as a potential solution. But one of the reasons, on top of the gravity and I think the culture shifting nature of the Equifax breach, is the fact that we basically found or had reported via our platform to a customer the exact same vulnerability which had been missed as part of a regular scanning program within a client of ours that was of a similar size and nature. And the interesting thing to call out on this is it's actually the 18th of March. So, in terms of the internal patching program, the time between discovery, notification, scanning starting to pop up on the internet and patching happening, and then this coming in as, hey, something you should look at right now. It's a pretty critical issue, and we seem to be able to get to it fairly easy over the internet. What I'm not saying is, the white hat hacker community would have 100% to a certainty discovered the Equifax vulnerability, and then Equifax would have gone and fixed it. But based on the evidence that we've seen in this case and what we see often repeated in other instances around the place, it certainly could have helped.
Yeah, this is one such proof point. The date here is pretty incredible. I mean, it's shortly after the CERT notification. And so what you find is that researchers kind of harness these data sources such as CERT to go out and really take that research and take that information that's being released and apply that. So they really serve a function of making this research actionable and delivering information to customers that can be immediately actioned. So in this case, this particular customer was able to fix this shortly after this was reported according to their policy and prevented a situation in which, a very similar thing could have potentially happened. So I think it's a useful and interesting proof point. As Casey said, it doesn't necessarily mean this is a complete solution. We believe in a layered approach, but we do think that this is an important layer that needs to be applied to AppSec programs.
Absolutely, yeah. The thing to call out here, just to put a button on this, one of the things that's really interesting that we see in terms of the behavior of the white hat community after the announcement of a commonly known vulnerability as opposed to something in bespoke code, is that they'll spend a bunch of time finding it in places where organizations that are deploying infrastructure might have forgotten to look. The whole model of especially when there's an incentive in place and there's a bug bounty program, is the first to find each unique issue is the one who gets paid. So there's incentive for them not just to go out and look, but to try to be creative and actually think like an attacker and look in places where others wouldn't have. So
that's exactly right. I mean, there are numerous issues that get reported on a regular basis, such as issues found with the code being committed to GitHub, with Git repositories sitting somewhere that's accessible publicly, with S3 buckets that have been reported, left insecure in an insecure configuration with their ACL, with DNS misconfigurations. And these aren't really AppSec issues. They aren't really necessarily infrastructure issues. They're kind of in that gray area in between where researchers get creative and dig into the possibility of things kind of living between those various layers. So, harnessing the community to do some of this research on your behalf is really pretty key to success here.
Absolutely. So to recap, really what we've run through here in terms of our interpreted lessons from the Equifax breach is the importance of reinforcing the difficult basics, going back to basics, checking in on those things and making sure they're being done well. The second is to expect an increasing amount of accountability in your organization from the outside world around how proactive and mature your security program is. And the third is really, an invitation to consider our approach to creating a better feedback loop and baking that into your security program, as well as to think about the other loops that you might already have in place and working on how to tweak them. So yeah, that's it. That's all from us. I'd like to really thank you for staying tuned in. We'd love to continue the conversation with you guys. I'm Casey John Ellis on Twitter, and John is J Cramp on Twitter. Feel free to reach out, give us your feedback, ask questions. Let's continue making the world a safer place. Cheers.